The bikers bullied a 93-year-old black veteran, destroying his home and threatening his neighbors. But one unexpected phone call turned everything around and made them regret every single thing they did. What happened in the aftermath? Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and post in the comments where you're watching this from. Elijah Eli Robinson stood at the edge of his small garden, gripping the worn wooden handle of a spade. The early morning sun painted his dark skin in warm golden hues, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. At 97 years old, his movements were deliberate and slow, but his mind was as sharp as it had ever been. The garden before him was not just a collection of flowers and plants. It was a sanctuary of memories and a testament to a life of resilience. Every day began the same for Eli, with rituals that tethered him to his past. He raised the American flag at the corner of his yard with the precision he had learned as a soldier decades ago. The flagpole had been erected by his own hands, its base surrounded by vibrant roses he and his late wife, Loretta, had planted together in the 1950s. Today, the roses were in full bloom, their rich reds and whites glowing under the soft sunlight. Eli moved to the flagpole and began the familiar routine. His hands, marked by age and calloused from a lifetime of work, worked the rope with steady care. As the stars and stripes climbed higher into the sky, he paused, saluting with a reverence that came from deep within him. This was his moment of quiet defiance, a tribute to the men he had fought alongside during World War II and to the ideals he still believed the flag stood for, even if the world often fell short of those ideals. When the flag was secure, Eli stood for a moment longer, his back straight despite the ache that had become a constant companion. He glanced towards the photos on his porch, black and white images of himself as a young soldier standing beside the members of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, the first African-American armored unit to see combat in the war. He had been barely 20 then, brimming with youthful fire, ready to prove himself in a world that doubted him at every turn. The neighborhood around him was quiet and unassuming, much like Eli himself. Cedar Street had been his home for over 70 years, and he had watched it change as families came and went. Yet, he remained a constant, a fixture of stability in a world that often felt too chaotic. The kids in the neighborhood called him Grandpa Eli, even though he wasn't related to any of them. He didn't mind. It reminded him of the family he and Loretta had never been able to have. After lowering his salute, Eli turned back to the garden. The roses needed trimming, and the tulips had to be checked for pests. His garden was not just a pastime. It was a responsibility, something to nurture and care for in the absence of Loretta. She'd been gone for over a decade now, but her presence lingered in every corner of their home, every blade of grass in the yard. As he reached for his pruning shears, he heard the faint rumble of engines in the distance. At first, he didn't pay it much mind. Cedar Street was usually quiet, save for the occasional delivery truck or the laughter of children. But as the noise grew louder, Eli looked up, frowning. A line of motorcycles appeared at the far end of the street, their engines roaring like a pack of wild animals. The sight was jarring. Cedar Street wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect a group of bikers to pass through, let alone linger. There were at least 10 of them, clad in black leather jackets adorned with red emblems that Eli couldn't make out from a distance. They rode with a swagger that spoke of arrogance and defiance, and as they passed his house, one of them revved his engine loudly, startling the birds in the trees. Eli's frown deepened. He had seen his fair share of trouble in life, and knew the kind of men who sought it out. There was an edge to these riders, something about the way they carried themselves that set his nerves on edge. He watched as they pulled into the lot of the old furniture warehouse across the street. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. It was an eyesore, but one Eli had learned to ignore. Now, it seemed, the warehouse had new tenants. Eli set his shears down and straightened, his gaze fixed on the bikers as they dismounted and began to mill around. They spoke loudly, their laughter grating against the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a red snake tattoo coiling up his neck, appeared to be the leader. He gestured toward the warehouse, and the group began breaking the chains on the front doors. "Mornin', Mr. Robinson." Jenny, the 12-year-old girl from next door, called out as she rode her bike past his yard. Eli forced a smile and waved, his eyes flicking back to the warehouse. Jenny followed his gaze and slowed her bike, her expression turning uneasy. "Who are they?" she asked, stopping by his gate. "Trouble," Eli muttered under his breath. He didn't want to alarm her, so he added, "Just some folks passing through, I imagine." Jenny nodded, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "Be careful, Mr. Robinson," she said before pedaling off toward her house. Eli stood there for a long time, watching the bikers until they disappeared into the warehouse. Something told him they weren't just passing through. The peaceful rhythm of Cedar Street had been disrupted, and Eli had the sinking feeling that it wouldn't return anytime soon. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noise from the warehouse began. Music blasted from speakers, accompanied by shouting and laughter. Eli closed the window to his small living room, hoping to muffle the sound, but it still seeped through. He tried to focus on the book in his lap, an old favorite Loretta had loved, but the words blurred on the page. He glanced at the photos on the wall, at the faces of his comrades in their crisp uniforms. They had faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of bikers. Eli told himself that this too would pass, but deep down he knew better. The storm had arrived, and it was only just beginning. For the first time in years, Cedar Street no longer felt like home. The sound of engines roared to life before the sun had fully risen the next morning. Elijah Robinson stirred in his bed, the distant growl disrupting the peace he had become so accustomed to. Pulling himself up with a groan, he shuffled to the window and peered outside. The warehouse across the street was now teeming with activity. The bikers, more of them than yesterday, had parked their motorcycles in a disorganized sprawl, spilling onto the sidewalk and even into the street. Eli's eyes narrowed as he noticed the condition of the neighborhood. Beer bottles and fast food wrappers littered the sidewalk. One of the street lights flickered weakly, its cover shattered. Cedar Street, once a clean and welcoming place, was starting to resemble a junkyard. His gaze lingered on a group of bikers lounging by the warehouse's entrance, smoking and laughing loudly. One of them noticed Eli watching from his window and gave a mocking wave. The others followed suit, shouting something unintelligible. Eli stepped back, letting the curtain fall into place. His jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of their disdain even through the glass. After his morning ritual of raising the flag, Eli went about his day as usual. He cleaned up the trash strewn across his yard, repaired a loose board on the porch, and tended to his garden. But the noise from the warehouse was relentless, the thrum of engines and the blare of music disrupting the neighborhood's tranquility. It wasn't just the volume, it was the sheer disrespect that grated on Eli's nerves. By the afternoon, the bikers' influence had started to spill over. A few of them began parking their motorcycles on the lawns of nearby houses, including Eli's. He watched in disbelief as one particularly large man kicked over a planter filled with blooming tulips. The biker didn't even glance down at the damage he'd caused. He simply lit a cigarette and leaned against his bike as though the lawn was his own. Eli's hands shook, not from fear, but from the anger bubbling up inside him. He walked outside, gripping his cane tightly. "This is private property," he said, his voice firm despite his age. "You have no right to be here." The man looked at him, a lazy smirk spreading across his face. "Didn't see your name on it, old man." "I'm telling you now," Eli shot back, taking a step closer. "Get off my lawn." Another biker joined the first, a wiry man with tattoos running up his arms. "What are you going to do if we don't?" he sneered. "Call the cops?" Eli's lips pressed into a thin line. The truth was, the local police had already shown how little they could, or would, do. He'd called them the night before about the noise, only to be told there wasn't enough evidence of wrongdoing to take action. The larger biker stepped forward, towering over Eli. "Listen, Grandpa," he said, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the grass. "We're not going anywhere. So why don't you go inside and take a nap or something?" Eli didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He simply held the man's gaze, his silence speaking volumes. Finally, the biker let out a laugh and gestured to his friend. "Come on, let's leave the old guy to his garden." The two bikers mounted their motorcycles, revved their engines unnecessarily loud, and sped off, tearing up Eli's grass as they went. He stood there for a long time, staring at the deep tire tracks etched into the soil. His tulips, crushed and broken, lay scattered across the ground like fallen soldiers. That evening, Eli sat on his porch, the shattered remains of his planter at his feet. He didn't bother turning on the radio or opening his book. Instead, he watched the warehouse, the activity there only intensifying as the sun set. More bikers arrived, bringing with them more noise, more chaos. One group gathered around a car they'd dragged into the lot, taking turns smashing it with bats and crowbars, their laughter echoing down the street. Eli's neighbors were starting to retreat. He noticed curtains drawn tightly in the windows, front doors that hadn't opened all day. Even Jenny, the spirited girl who always greeted him with a smile, hadn't ventured out on her bike. Cedar Street was falling silent, not from peace, but from fear. The following morning, Eli discovered his mailbox had been vandalized. The metal was bent and twisted, the flag torn off. He frowned, examining the damage. It wasn't enough for them to disrupt the neighborhood. They were targeting him specifically now. He tried to fix it, using pliers to straighten the metal as best he could, but the damage was severe. As he worked, a few bikers rode by, their laughter ringing in his ears. One of them slowed down, calling out, "Nice mailbox, Grandpa. You need a new one?" Eli didn't respond. He kept his head down, focusing on the task at hand. But inside, he was seething. Later that day, Eli decided to confront the leader of the bikers. He walked across the street to the warehouse, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. As he approached, the bikers stopped what they were doing and turned to watch him. Their stares were mocking, their postures relaxed. Eli ignored their smirks and addressed the man with the snake tattoo, who was clearly in charge. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Eli began, his voice steady but edged with steel, "but this is a residential neighborhood. We don't need your noise or your mess." The leader, who went by the name Scar, chuckled and leaned against his bike. "We're not hurting anyone, old man. Just having a little fun." "You call tearing up lawns and vandalizing property fun?" Eli shot back. "This is my home. It's my neighbor's home. We won't stand for it." Scar's smirk faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You won't stand for it, huh? And what are you going to do about it? Huh, Pops?" The bikers around him laughed, their voices a grating chorus of mockery. Eli met Scar's gaze, his jaw set. "I've dealt with men like you before," he said evenly. "Bullies who think they can take what they want because no one's strong enough to stop them. But you're not as untouchable as you think." Scar stepped closer, his size intimidating, but not enough to make Eli flinch. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "But I'd watch myself if I were you. You don't want to make enemies you can't handle." Eli turned and walked away, his cane tapping against the pavement once more. He didn't look back, even as the bikers shouted insults after him. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Cedar Street was his home, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. As he reached his porch, he paused to look back at the warehouse. The bikers were still laughing, their figures dark silhouettes against the flickering light of a barrel fire. Eli's gaze shifted to his flag, fluttering weakly in the wind. It was still there, still standing. For now. The morning brought a brittle chill, though the skies were clear and the sun was bright. Elijah Robinson woke to a quiet that felt unnatural, a silence that pressed against the walls of his small home. He shuffled out of bed, his joints protesting with every step, and moved to the window. Cedar Street was empty, save for a few beer bottles rolling lazily in the breeze and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. His gaze drifted to his garden, where yesterday's damage still marred the pristine rows of flowers and the carefully laid stones. The deep tire tracks through his lawn reminded him of scars, the kind that never fully heal. But it wasn't the sight of his ruined tulips or the broken planter that made him hesitate to step outside. It was the flag. The American flag, which had flown proudly in his yard every morning for decades, now hung limp at an angle. The pole was bent, the rope frayed and twisted. His heart sank as he realized it had been tampered with, perhaps even deliberately targeted. He dressed quickly, pulling on his cardigan and carefully tucking in the crisp white shirt that Loretta had always ironed for him in years past. Outside, he approached the flagpole, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with anger. The closer he got, the more evident the damage became. The base of the pole was scratched and dented, as if someone had tried to yank it from the ground. The flag itself, once vibrant and clean, was smeared with dirt and oil, its edges torn. Eli knelt slowly, ignoring the protest of his knees, and cradled the torn fabric in his hands. The weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. This wasn't just a piece of cloth to him. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything his comrades had died for. He could still see their faces in his mind, young, determined, filled with a hope that often didn't survive the battlefield. His grip tightened on the flag. He wasn't a man prone to tears, but in that moment, he felt the sting of betrayal, not from the bikers who had done this, but from a world that seemed to have forgotten what that flag represented. The rumble of engines snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned his head sharply to see a group of bikers riding past, their laughter carrying across the street like a taunt. One of them pointed in Eli's direction, nudging his companion as if to share a joke. Eli rose to his feet, the flag still in his hands. He straightened his back as much as his age allowed and stared after them until they disappeared around the corner. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface was now boiling over. This was no longer just about a flag or a garden. This was about respect. Respect for him, for his neighbors, and for the community he had spent his life nurturing. He brought the flag inside and laid it carefully on the dining room table. Taking a bowl of soapy water and a clean rag, he began the painstaking task of cleaning it. His hands moved with deliberate care, smoothing the fabric and wiping away the grime. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the war. He remembered the sweltering heat of Europe, the way the air had smelled of gunpowder and mud. His unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, had been a brotherhood forged in the fires of combat and prejudice. They had faced both the enemy abroad and the discrimination of their own country. But through it all, they had carried the flag, holding it high even when everything around them seemed to crumble. The flag on his table now wasn't the same one he had carried then, but it bore the same weight. And just like then, he would not let it fall without a fight. When the flag was as clean as he could manage, Eli folded it carefully and set it aside. He would need to repair the pole before he could raise it again, and that would take time. For now, he moved to the front porch, where he could keep an eye on the warehouse. The day wore on, and the bikers' activity grew louder. They had begun to spread their influence beyond the warehouse, spilling onto the sidewalks and into the yards of nearby homes. A few of them leaned against fences, smoking and drinking, their eyes scanning the street with a mix of boredom and menace. By mid-afternoon, Eli noticed movement in his neighbor's yard. Jenny, the 12-year-old girl who had always been so full of energy, was cautiously retrieving her bike from the driveway. She glanced nervously at the bikers as she mounted it and began to pedal away. One of the men, a wiry figure with tattoos snaking up his arms, whistled sharply. "Hey, little girl," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Why don't you come say hi?" Jenny froze, her hands gripping the handlebars tightly. Eli's blood ran cold as he watched her head bow, her small frame shrinking under the weight of the man's taunts. She didn't respond, instead pedaling faster down the street. Eli's hands curled into fists. He had seen enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the bikers' antics escalated. Music blared from portable speakers, the bass vibrating through the walls of Eli's home. Laughter and shouting echoed across the street, interspersed with the sound of bottles shattering against pavement. Eli sat in his living room, staring at the photos on the wall. Loretta's gentle smile looked back at him, her eyes full of the quiet strength he had always admired. He thought of what she would say if she were here now, how she would tell him to stand tall and not let anyone take away what they had built together. But Loretta wasn't here, and the weight of that absence pressed heavily on him. A sudden crash jolted him from his thoughts. He rushed to the window and saw the source of the noise, his mailbox now lying twisted and broken in the street. A group of bikers stood nearby, laughing and high-fiving each other. One of them spotted Eli at the window and gave a mock salute. "Nice mailbox, old man," he shouted, his voice dripping with derision. Eli turned away from the window, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He moved to the dining room where the folded flag still lay on the table. His fingers brushed against the fabric as he thought about the men he had fought beside, the sacrifices they had made. They had faced tanks and machine guns, endured the terror of enemy fire. And yet, here he was, being bullied by a group of overgrown children with motorcycles. His gaze shifted to the phone on the wall. For the first time, he considered reaching out for help. He still had the number of an old friend, someone who might understand what he was going through. but the thought of asking for assistance left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had always been a man who handled his own problems. The music outside grew louder, and Eli's resolve hardened. He wasn't ready to give up, not on his flag, not on his home, and not on the neighborhood he had called his own for so many years. If the bikers thought they could break him, they were sorely mistaken. He would stand his ground. Eli awoke to a thunderous crash that rattled the very walls of his house. The old veteran sat bolt upright, his heart hammering as he reached for the cane propped against his bedside. The clock on the nightstand read 2:47 a.m. Another crash echoed through the night, followed by the sound of roaring laughter and the unmistakable screech of motorcycles. Shuffling to the window, Eli pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside. His blood ran cold. A group of bikers were gathered in his front yard, illuminated by the harsh glare of their headlights. Two of them were taking turns kicking over the remnants of his garden gnome collection, small figurines that Loretta had once delighted in arranging among the flower beds. Another was throwing empty beer bottles against the side of his house, the shattering glass adding to the cacophony. Eli's fist tightened on the window frame. These weren't just pranks or acts of mischief. This was deliberate, calculated intimidation. The bikers weren't content with terrorizing the street. They were targeting him specifically now. Grabbing his coat, Eli stepped onto his porch, his cane tapping against the wooden boards. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the acrid smell of burning rubber. The bikers turned toward him as one, their faces split into mocking grins. "Well, look who's awake," one of them drawled, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck. He lifted a beer bottle in a mock toast. "Hope we didn't disturb your beauty sleep, Grandpa." Eli ignored the taunt, his eyes narrowing as they fell on the damage they had wrought. His mailbox was gone entirely, replaced by a pile of smoldering ash. The roses he had painstakingly nurtured over decades lay trampled and broken, their bright blooms scattered like debris. But the worst was the flagpole. It had been wrenched from the ground and lay in the dirt, the American flag ripped to tatters beside it. "You've made your point," Eli said, his voice firm despite the quaver of age. "Now leave." The leader of the group, the tall man they called Scar, stepped forward. His presence was imposing, the snake tattoo on his neck seeming to writhe in the flickering light. "And what point is that, old man?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. "That this street belongs to us now? Because I think you're just starting to get it." Eli stared him down, his hand tightening on his cane. "This street belongs to the people who built it, to the families who've lived here for generations, not to you." Scar smirked, stepping closer. "You think anyone around here's gonna back you up? Look around, Pops. Your neighbors are too scared to leave their houses. They're done. And so are you." The other bikers laughed, their jeers echoing into the night. One of them kicked over what remained of a garden bench, the splintered wood crunching under his boots. Another revved his motorcycle, spraying dirt and gravel across the lawn. Eli took a step forward, his back straightening as much as his years would allow. "I've faced men a hell of a lot tougher than you," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a whip. "Men who didn't just talk big, but fought for what they believed in. And let me tell you something, you're not as untouchable as you think." Scar's smirk faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then he laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, "but guts won't save you. Maybe it's time we showed you what happens when you don't know your place." Before Eli could react, one of the bikers lit a small object and hurled it toward the porch. It landed with a dull thud and burst into flames. A Molotov cocktail, its crude design sending fire licking up the wooden steps. Eli staggered back, his eyes widening. The bikers roared with laughter as he scrambled for the garden hose, his hands trembling as he twisted the nozzle. Water sprayed over the flames, extinguishing them before they could spread, but the damage was done. The scorched wood and lingering smoke were a reminder of just how far the bikers were willing to go. When the flames were out, Eli turned back toward the group, his chest heaving with both exertion and fury. "That's enough," he said, his voice rising above the din. "You've had your fun. Now get off my property before I call the police." Scar's grin widened, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Go ahead," he said. "Call them. See if they care. See if anyone cares." Eli hesitated. He had already called the police twice in the past week, and each time the response had been the same: polite sympathy followed by inaction. They claimed there wasn't enough evidence, that they couldn't intervene unless someone was physically harmed. But tonight was different. This was arson, plain and simple. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed. Scar watched him, his grin never wavering. "You think they're going to show up?" he called out. "You think anyone's coming to save you?" The call connected, and Eli quickly relayed the situation. The dispatcher assured him that a patrol car would be sent, but the words felt hollow, like promises made out of obligation rather than conviction. True to form, the bikers didn't wait around for the police. As the sound of sirens grew faintly audible in the distance, they mounted their motorcycles and roared off into the night, leaving destruction in their wake. When the officers finally arrived, they found Eli standing on his porch, his face set in a mask of weary determination. He explained what had happened, pointing out the damage to his property, the scorched steps, the ruined garden. The officers listened politely, nodding and taking notes, but their reluctance was palpable. "We'll file a report," one of them said, his tone careful. "But without witnesses or video evidence, it's going to be hard to press charges." Eli's jaw tightened. "They threw a firebomb onto my porch," he said, his voice sharp. "Isn't that enough?" The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. "We'll do what we can, Mr. Robinson," he said finally. "But these things take time." Time. It was a commodity Eli didn't have much of, and he knew it. As the officers left, promising to increase patrols in the area, Eli returned to his house. The smell of smoke still lingered, seeping into the walls and his clothes. He sank into his armchair, his hands trembling as he picked up the photo of Loretta that sat on the side table. "I'm trying," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But it's getting harder, Loretta. So much harder." His eyes drifted to the flag, now neatly folded on the dining room table. It was battered and torn, but still whole. It was a reminder of what he had fought for, what he had sacrificed for. And it was a reminder of why he couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. As the first light of dawn broke over Cedar Street, Eli made a decision. He would not let these men take everything from him. He would not let them win. It was time to fight back. Eli sat at his kitchen table, the rising sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden surface. The folded flag sat before him, its tattered edges a stark reminder of the night before. His hands rested on the table, fingers tracing the familiar grooves in the wood as he stared at the phone on the wall. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. For the first time in years, Eli felt truly alone. Cedar Street, his home for over 7 decades, no longer felt like a sanctuary. The neighborhood that had once been filled with laughter and camaraderie was now silent, its residents hiding behind drawn curtains and locked doors. Even Jenny, the fearless girl next door, hadn't ventured outside since the bikers arrived. Eli's gaze drifted to the photo of Loretta hanging on the wall. Her smile, captured in a moment of joy so many years ago, seemed to urge him forward. "You'd know what to do," he muttered. But Loretta wasn't here, and the weight of protecting their home now rested solely on his shoulders. His eyes returned to the phone. Somewhere in the depths of his memory, a name and a number surfaced. It was an old contact, someone he hadn't spoken to in decades. Back when he had first moved to Cedar Street, he joined a local veterans group. One of the members, Jeremiah Steele Reed, had given him a card with a phone number and a simple promise: "If you ever need us, call." Eli had kept that card tucked away in his wallet for years, more out of sentimentality than expectation. But now, as he retrieved the worn leather billfold from his dresser, he realized that he'd never needed help more than he did today. He unfolded the card, the faded ink barely legible, and dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "This is Steele." Eli hesitated for a moment, the weight of the years between them suddenly palpable. Then he straightened his back and spoke. "Jeremiah Reed?" The voice on the other end grew sharper. "Who's asking?" "Elijah Robinson," he said. 761st Tank Battalion." There was a pause, long enough for Eli to wonder if the call had been disconnected. Then Steele's voice returned, softer now but no less firm. "Elijah Robinson," he said. 761st Tank Battalion." There was a pause, long enough for Eli to wonder if the call had been disconnected. Then Steele's voice returned, softer now, but no less firm. "Elijah Robinson. Damn, I thought you were just a story we told about the toughest son of a gun we ever met. What's going on, old friend?" Eli explained the situation as plainly as he could, though his voice faltered more than once. He told Steele about the bikers, the vandalism, the threats, and the growing fear that had taken hold of Cedar Street. When he finished, the line was quiet again. "We'll handle it," Steele said finally. "You just sit tight." Eli frowned. "Jeremiah, I didn't call to pass the buck. I just need advice." "You called me, Eli," Steele interrupted. "And you know what that means. You don't have to fight this alone, not anymore." Before Eli could argue, Steele hung up. Eli stared at the receiver, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he had just set in motion, but there was no turning back now. The hours that followed were tense. Eli kept to his routine as best he could, though his gaze frequently strayed to the window. The bikers were quieter than usual, their antics subdued in the harsh light of day. But the damage to his property was still evident, a testament to the chaos they had brought. As the afternoon wore on, a low rumble began to fill the air. At first, Eli thought it was another group of bikers arriving at the warehouse, but as the sound grew louder, he realized it was different, deeper, more rhythmic. He stepped onto his porch, his cane in hand, and stared down the street. What he saw made his breath catch. Motorcycles. Dozens of them, their polished chrome gleaming in the sunlight. They moved in perfect formation, their riders clad in leather vests adorned with patches and emblems. These weren't the scruffy, chaotic bikers who had plagued Cedar Street. These were veterans, their presence exuding discipline and purpose. The lead bike pulled up in front of Eli's house, and the rider dismounted. He was a tall man, his hair streaked with gray, but his posture as straight as a soldier's. He removed his helmet, revealing a face weathered by years and experience. A broad smile broke across his lips as he approached. "Eli Robinson," Steele said, extending a hand. "Still standing tall, I see." Eli shook his hand, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You look like you've been through hell and back, Jeremiah." Steele chuckled. "Haven't we all?" He turned and gestured to the riders behind him. "Brought a few friends. Figured you could use some backup." Eli looked past him, taking in the sight of the assembled riders. Men and women of all ages, each one wearing a vest adorned with military patches: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Their expressions were a mixture of camaraderie and determination. The bikers from the warehouse had begun to notice the commotion. A few of them emerged from the building, their faces twisted in confusion. Scar stepped forward, his tattooed neck craning as he surveyed the newcomers. "What the hell is this?" Scar shouted, his voice cutting through the low hum of engines. Steele turned to face him, his smile vanishing. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the street, "is a reminder of what real strength looks like." The veterans dismounted one by one, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They formed a loose line behind Steele, their presence alone enough to make the original bikers hesitate. Scar sneered, but Eli could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think you're tough?" Scar spat. "You think you can scare us off?" Steele didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered book. He flipped it open to a page filled with names, then held it up. "These are the men I fought with," he said, "the ones who didn't make it back. We've seen more blood and fire than you could ever imagine. So don't mistake our patience for weakness." For the first time, Scar seemed to falter. The confidence that had carried him through weeks of tormenting Cedar Street was cracking under the weight of Steele's words. Eli stepped forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. "You wanted to know what I was going to do about you," he said, his voice steady and strong. "Well, here's your answer." Scar's gang began to shift uneasily, their bravado waning as the veterans closed ranks. Steele's riders didn't need to throw a punch or raise their voices. Their mere presence was enough to tip the balance. "We're not leaving," Steele said calmly, "and if you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with all of us." Scar glared at him, his fists clenching at his sides. But after a moment, he turned sharply and barked an order to his men. "Back inside." The bikers retreated, their swagger noticeably diminished. The veterans didn't move, their eyes trained on the warehouse until the last of Scar's gang disappeared from view. Steele turned back to Eli, his expression softening. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We're here for the long haul." Eli nodded, his chest swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope, a fragile but resilient flame that burned brighter with every moment. The fight wasn't over, but Eli knew one thing for certain. He wasn't fighting it alone. The calm that had settled over Cedar Street after the arrival of the veteran bikers was short-lived. For 2 days, the veterans stationed themselves outside the warehouse, keeping a vigilant watch. Their presence alone was enough to keep the bikers subdued. The neighborhood, though still quiet, began to stir with cautious optimism. Curtains that had been drawn tightly were now cracked open, and a few brave neighbors ventured onto their porches, curious to see what might happen next. Eli watched from his window as Jeremiah, Steele Reed, and his group of veterans worked to repair the damage done to his property. They straightened his mailbox, cleaned up the debris from his garden, and even erected a temporary flagpole to replace the one the bikers had destroyed. Eli felt a deep gratitude that words couldn't express, but he also knew the peace was fragile. The bikers weren't going to back down easily. It started that evening. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the bikers emerged from the warehouse in force. Their numbers seemed to have grown. There were at least 30 of them now, their motorcycles forming an intimidating row along the street. Scar stood at the center, his snake tattoo catching the flickering light of the street lamp. He looked more determined than ever, his eyes cold and calculating as they scanned the veterans gathered in front of Eli's house. "You think you've won?" Scar called out, his voice carrying over the rumble of idling engines. "You think a bunch of washed-up old men can run us out of here?" Steele stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "We're not here to run you out," he said. "We're here to remind you that this isn't your street, and it never will be." Scar laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Big talk for someone who doesn't know when to quit. He gestured to his men, and suddenly the air was filled with the deafening roar of engines. The bikers began circling the veterans, their motorcycles kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. The veterans stood their ground, their formation unbroken, but Eli could see the tension in their faces. This wasn't going to end without a fight. Eli stepped onto his porch, gripping his cane tightly. The sight of his fellow veterans holding the line filled him with both pride and unease. These men and women had come to help him, to protect the neighborhood he had called home for so long, but the stakes were higher now, and the bikers were clearly ready to escalate. The first act of violence came suddenly. One of the bikers veered close to the line of veterans and threw a bottle, its glass shattering against the pavement at Steele's feet. The other bikers cheered, emboldened by the display. Another biker followed suit, hurling a rock that narrowly missed one of the veterans. "That's enough," Steele bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not here to fight, but we will defend ourselves if we have to." Scar grinned, his expression twisted with defiance. "You're not the only ones who know how to fight, old man." He gave a signal, and the bikers dismounted their motorcycles, their movements quick and coordinated. Some of them carried chains, others bats or crowbars. They advanced slowly, their intentions unmistakable. The veterans didn't retreat. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions grim but resolute. Steele turned his head slightly, speaking just loud enough for his group to hear. "Hold the line. Don't give them an inch." Eli watched from the porch, his heart pounding. He wanted to join them, to stand with his brothers and sisters, but he knew his body wasn't what it once was. Instead, he focused on what he could do. He reached for the phone and called the police, explaining the escalating situation in as much detail as he could. The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but Eli knew it might be too late by the time they arrived. The first blow landed moments later. One of the bikers swung a chain at a veteran who blocked it with his forearm before countering with a punch that sent the biker staggering back. The skirmish ignited the rest of the gang, and chaos erupted on Cedar Street. Eli watched in horror as the two groups clashed. The veterans, though outnumbered, fought with precision and discipline, their military training evident in every move. The bikers, on the other hand, relied on brute strength and sheer aggression. The sound of fists meeting flesh, the clang of metal, and the shouts of both groups filled the air. Steele was at the center of it all, moving with the confidence of a man who had faced worse odds and far harsher conditions. He ducked a wild swing from a crowbar and retaliated with a swift uppercut that sent his opponent to the ground. Around him, the other veterans held their own, forming a defensive circle to protect each other. But the bikers weren't just targeting the veterans. As the fight raged on, a few of them broke away and turned their attention to Eli's house. One of them hurled a Molotov cocktail at the porch, the flames licking up the wooden steps before Eli managed to douse them with a fire extinguisher. Another biker smashed the windows with a baseball bat, the glass shattering in a spray of jagged shards. Eli's chest tightened as he watched the destruction. His home, the place he and Loretta had built together, was being torn apart before his eyes. But even as fear gripped him, a familiar fire began to burn in his chest. He wasn't going to let them take everything he had fought for. Grabbing his old service pistol from the lockbox in his bedroom, Eli stepped outside once more. He didn't raise the weapon, but its presence was enough to make the bikers pause. His voice, though hoarse with age, rang out clear and strong. "That's enough," he shouted. "You want to destroy something? Start with me. Leave my house, leave my neighbors, and fight me if you have to." The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering as they took in the sight of the defiant old man standing on his porch. Scar, still locked in combat with Steele, noticed the shift and barked an order. "Fall back." The bikers retreated reluctantly, their faces a mix of anger and frustration. The veterans, battered but unbroken, held their ground as the gang mounted their motorcycles and roared off into the night. Eli lowered the pistol, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. Steele approached him, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes shining with pride. "You've got guts, old man," he said, "more than most." Eli managed a weak smile. "I've faced worse," he said, though his voice wavered. The sound of sirens grew louder, and moments later, police cars flooded the street. Officers quickly assessed the scene, their faces grim as they took in the damage. Statements were taken, but it was clear that the bikers would be back. This was far from over. As the officers departed, Steele placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "We'll be ready," he said. "This isn't just your fight anymore." Eli nodded, his resolve hardening. The battle for Cedar Street was just beginning, but he knew one thing for certain. With allies like these, he wasn't alone. The morning after the battle on Cedar Street dawned quiet, the kind of stillness that feels fragile, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Elijah Robinson stepped onto his porch, leaning heavily on his cane. His body ached from the tension and chaos of the night before, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The veterans were still there, stationed in small groups along the street, their presence a quiet reassurance. They had worked through the early hours, cleaning up the broken glass and scorched remains of his porch steps, restoring what they could of the damage left behind. The air smelled of ash and faintly of oil, remnants of the bikers' retreat. Across the street, the warehouse stood silent, its windows dark. But Eli knew better than to believe the fight was truly over. Scar and his gang had retreated, but they hadn't been defeated. Not yet. Steele approached, his leather vest streaked with dirt and sweat. Despite the weariness in his face, his posture was straight, his eyes sharp. He nodded at Eli, a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried the weight of their shared understanding. "They'll be back," Steele said, his voice low. Eli nodded. "I'm counting on it." The veterans had already begun fortifying their positions. They set up a perimeter around the warehouse, parking their motorcycles strategically to block the entrances. A few of them worked in teams, installing small security cameras they had brought with them, their military-grade equipment far more advanced than anything the bikers would have expected. Eli watched as the neighborhood began to stir. A few of his neighbors stepped cautiously onto their porches, drawn by the sight of the veterans' activity. Jenny, the 12-year-old girl from next door, appeared in her front yard, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She waved tentatively at Eli, and he waved back, a small smile breaking through the lines of his face. For the first time in weeks, the fear in her expression had eased, replaced by something resembling hope. By mid-afternoon, the tension had reached a boiling point. The bikers returned, their numbers swelled to nearly 50. They roared down the street in a show of force, their engines echoing like thunder. Scar led the charge, his snake tattoo glinting in the sunlight as he pulled up in front of the veterans' barricade. The two groups stood opposite each other, the street between them an invisible battlefield. The bikers were loud, brash, their aggression barely contained. The veterans, in contrast, were silent, their formation tight and disciplined. Eli stood with them, his cane in one hand and his worn service pistol tucked discreetly into his waistband. He wouldn't use it unless he had to, but its presence was a comfort. Scar dismounted his motorcycle and strode forward, his expression twisted with contempt. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" he spat, his voice carrying over the rumble of engines. "This is our turf now. You're just delaying the inevitable." Steele stepped forward to meet him, his face calm but unyielding. "This street belongs to the people who live here," he said, "not to cowards who think intimidation makes them strong." Scar's eyes narrowed, and he gestured to his gang. "You think you can stop us? You think a bunch of old men can take us on?" Steele didn't flinch. He turned to the veterans behind him, then to Eli, who stood at his side. "We're not here to fight," Steele said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But if you think we're going to let you destroy this neighborhood, you're dead wrong." The standoff lasted only a moment longer before Scar snarled and gave the order. "Take them down." The bikers surged forward, but the veterans were ready. They held their ground, their movements precise and coordinated, honed by years of training and experience. Fists flew, chains clashed against improvised shields, and the air filled with the sounds of struggle. Eli stayed on the outskirts, his cane gripped tightly as he watched the battle unfold. His heart pounded with both fear and pride. The bikers fought with brute force, but they were no match for the veterans' discipline. One by one, they began to falter, their confidence crumbling under the sheer determination of their opponents. Scar, however, was relentless. He barreled through the line, his sights set on Eli. "You think you're untouchable, old man?" Scar sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Eli didn't waver. He straightened his back and met Scar's gaze, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I've fought men like you before," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm still here." Scar lunged, but before he could reach Eli, Steele intercepted him. The two men clashed in a brutal exchange, their movements fierce and unrelenting. Steele's experience gave him the upper hand, and with a final, devastating punch, he sent Scar sprawling to the ground. The rest of the bikers, seeing their leader defeated, began to retreat. They scrambled onto their motorcycles, their bravado shattered, and roared away into the distance. The veterans didn't pursue them. They stood together, their breaths heavy, their faces marked with exhaustion, but also triumph. The street fell silent once more, the only sound the faint hum of the few remaining motorcycles. Eli stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the neighborhood. The damage was still visible, the broken windows, the scarred pavement, but there was something else now, something stronger. a sense of unity, of resilience that hadn't been there before. The police arrived minutes later, their sirens cutting through the quiet. This time, they didn't just take notes. Officers moved quickly to secure the warehouse, and it wasn't long before Scar and several of his gang members were led away in handcuffs. Eli watched as they were loaded into the back of a patrol car, the weight of weeks of fear finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. Steele joined him on the porch, his face softening as he clapped a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You did good, Eli," he said. "Real good." Eli shook his head. "I didn't do this alone." "No," Steele agreed, "but you were the one who stood up first. That takes guts." In the days that followed, Cedar Street began to heal. The veterans stayed to help repair the damage, their presence a reassuring reminder of the strength that comes from standing together. The warehouse, once a symbol of fear, was reclaimed and transformed into a community center for veterans and locals alike. Eli's garden was replanted, his flagpole restored, and every morning at dawn, the stars and stripes flew high once more. On the day the community center officially opened, the neighborhood gathered to celebrate. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing through the air, while neighbors who had once been strangers now stood side by side. Eli sat on his porch, watching it all with a quiet satisfaction. Steele approached, a grin spreading across his face. "You ready to raise the flag?"